how did Will Ferrell influence the start of what went on to be an 18-year venture for you, ending an exit to GoFundMe?
So it's not every day Will Ferrell shows up in a startup story, but he is in fact involved in this one.
There's a really common fork in the road for tech founders: bootstrapped or to raise money.
That's a cautionary tale that I'll let you in on. My advice would be,
the listeners of the show, all B2B software founders, I'm guessing some of these lessons were learned the hard way.
The thing that I struggled the most with as a founder was,
you have a cool background. So the listeners of the show, all B2B software founders, and you have done what many dream to accomplish and done it in a very interesting way. I see Will Ferrell behind you as the inspiration of Classy. So tell us the story. How did Will Ferrell influence the start of what went on to be an 18-year venture for you, ending in an exit to GoFundMe?
Yeah, so it's not every day Will Ferrell shows up in a startup story, but he is in fact involved in this one. So Classy actually started as a fundraiser for cancer research because my mom had cancer growing up. Twice, battled breast cancer, chemotherapy, radiation, the whole bit for a while, and had a pretty big impact on, obviously the family, but me, kind of growing up through that. And when I was about 24 years old, I was living in San Diego with a group of friends, and we decided we wanted to give back a little bit and do a fundraiser for cancer research. And we were struggling to come up with the name for this event, which ended up being a pub crawl of all things, collecting cash at the door. And the movie Anchorman happened to be on in our apartment. And my buddy Pete just turned to me casually and said, well, why don't we name the pub crawl the Stay Classy Pub Crawl? Never in a million years thinking that it would evolve into an actual, never mind a technology company, but even anything but a simple fundraiser with friends. And so we ended up raising some money for the Cancer Society, and that one event turned into dozens of different events. We expanded outside of pub crawls. We did athletic events and 5Ks. We did concerts. We did all sorts of stuff, all just to get young people involved in philanthropy earlier in life and to have some fun doing it. We were all in our 20s in San Diego. It's hard not to have fun in San Diego, that period of your life. But we started to get a look at what technology the nonprofits were actually using to try to raise money and to try to reach a younger generation of donor, because we were basically working hand in hand with them. And we kind of just said to ourselves one day, we think we could actually do this better than some of the options that are out there. We had no software experience. I'm a mechanical and industrial engineer, but I still to this day have maybe written 5 lines of code in my life. I was more of an artist and a designer growing up, so I took more of the design kind of angle on things. But we ended up relaunching as a technology company in 2011 after going through an incubator in San Diego. And we dropped the stay from the name and just became Classy, the technology company. So it has its roots with Will Ferrell. We kind of redefined the word in our brand, and it now ties to philanthropy, which is kind of cool. But little known fact, Will Ferrell did do a video for our company claiming that he was the founder, like as a spoof. It was pretty hilarious because we do this. We used to do this, and we still do, but an in-person award show for nonprofits to celebrate their impact. And he did a video for us and sent it to us for the whole audience. It was freaking hilarious. I think it's on YouTube somewhere.
That is awesome.
But it's freaking hilarious.
Dude, so cool. Oh, that's great. So let's fast forward to the point where, so there were 5 years where Classy was a non-tech company. And then in 2011 becomes a tech company. There's a really common fork in the road for tech founders in that we either decide to be bootstrapped or to raise money. Talk us through when were you at that intersection, and what caused you to decide to go on to raise some funds?
Yeah, I mean, we started with somewhat of an identity crisis, and I'll explain. We kind of, our first fork, even before raising money, was like, who do we want to be when we grow up? Who do we want to be when we grow up? Is it a B2C company, kind of like it that existed at the time, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, later GoFundMe, and really work on fundraising for individual causes? Or do we want to be a B2B SaaS company? Or do we want to try to do both? And we ended up deciding very strongly to go down the B2B path because we had read this book as a group, Good to Great by Jim Collins. You're probably familiar. And in there, he says, what can you be best in the world at? And that actually like really hit us hard. And we said, okay, what we can be best in the world at is working with nonprofits and helping them, because we've been doing events for them in the trenches essentially for the last 4 or 5 years. So we have a unique advantage down that path versus becoming a B2C company and competing with the likes of Kickstarter, et cetera, et cetera. So we at the time we kind of were doing a little bit of both. So we essentially got rid of the B2C side, doubled down on the B2B side. And that's when things started really to take off with the business. And we started to realize, well, wait a second here, like maybe people would be interested in this as like an awesome business opportunity. And so that really gave us the confidence to even think about raising money from investors. But we still bootstrapped for quite a while. We actually bootstrapped for the first several years, eventually raising only from angel investors. And we raised the first $5 million from all angel investors, and primarily from 3 super angels, who at the time we didn't call super angels, but they basically invested, say, 100K. And then they just kept seeing the traction of the company, and they would just re-up. And that was awesome. And it was very difficult to obviously find them at first. But once we did, it was almost like we had sort of these like really bought in partners, if you will, that had all been successful in their prior life in business, but knew something about the charity space. And that's actually what made it really difficult for us to raise money from institutions later. They just didn't understand the charity space. They thought we were a charity. They didn't understand how you could make a really positive impact, but also be a money-making venture at the same time. Like, this was all fairly new, and this was around 2011 to 2014. So it doesn't seem that long ago, but this was before the B Corp movement. This is before the word like sort of social enterprise was well known. And we kind of pitched ourselves as a hybrid, a company that could be a great business opportunity, but also do good while doing so. Almost like Patagonia in a different space. And that eventually started to catch on. But really what got us on the radar of institutional money was our partnership with Salesforce. So we had done an integration with Salesforce CRM that allowed Classy's fundraising platform to connect to the nonprofit version of their sales cloud, essentially. And they had identified nonprofit and higher ed as a really large growth opportunity for them. And so their venture team basically came knocking one day and said, hey, we see that you've built an integration with Salesforce. We're interested in this vertical. Seems like you're getting a lot of traction, and you guys are sort of starting to become, starting to get some momentum and become a leader. We're interested in investing. And so that was a very small check in the beginning. It was a 500K that expanded over time, but that gave us the credibility as a company, but also sort of in our space, in an industry, in a market that VCs might be interested in, to have the next couple conversations.
Totally.
But this journey played out over, that was like 5 years. It wasn't like we woke up and we're like, let's just go raise VC. It was more, let's bootstrap, then let's raise money, $25,000 at a time kind of thing on a convertible note from all angels. The smallest check we ever raised was from my now wife, which was $7,500 that I asked her to invest on a date. Good thing things worked out. But later on, the institutional money was much smaller than the rounds today. It was, $1.5 million, $2 million for the first, sort of Series A. And then we eventually raised bigger money, an $18 million round from Mithril Capital, which is Peter Thiel's other fund outside of Founders Fund. And then we did a Series C and D with the lead Norwest Venture Partners. So eventually we got into that more classical raise a large round kind of motion, but it was a long time getting there. And it was something where we felt we needed the capital to compete. I believe in today's world, things are different. And if I were to start Classy over again, I probably would have been even more capital efficient. I think you can do more with less these days. But we felt that because the space was old, but it was a little bit crowded, like a lot of older, smaller players, and it was hard to break through the noise as a new guy. We felt brute force was the way to do it, to just push through that. And it worked. Could we have saved a little bit more of the company in the earlier days? Yeah, sure. But at the end of the day, it ended up being a big company, and it was a home run bet from day one. Again, if I was to do it again, I'd probably aim for a double or triple and maybe hope for the home run, not necessarily put everything, all the eggs in one basket and just everything on black type of thing. But that's kind of how Classy was from day one.
That I love that. And I love that you referenced Patagonia. I think his name is Yvonne. He wrote the book, Let My People Go Surfing. And in there, he tells a story about having to lay off about 150 of his team members at a time when the company was really small. And he said the lesson he learned in that phase of his entrepreneurial journey was he never wanted to build a business that was dependent upon growth.
Yep.
And so they had to acquire enough inventory. So they made a huge bet, and they had to grow the next season in order to keep the employees they had. And I think that one of the things we coach on hard at SaaS Academy is making sure that you're running a SaaS business that doesn't need the next round of investment, to make sure that the unit economics at every stage of the business can continue to support the strategy. It can be an accelerant, and in many scenarios, it helps, like being able to choose the brute force growth strategy for Classy. You're saying now I've got more education, more experience. I know now I have more tools. It's okay if it's an option. We don't want it to be the only option. So I love hearing that was true in your experience. I'm curious, what would you do differently now? If you're a founder, what should someone know if they're raising money in 2024 or thinking about it? They're running a SaaS company. What's different? You're now on the investment side. I think you have this unique perspective of seeing both. What should a founder know about raising money in 2024?
I would just punt the decision as long as you can. I think that it's a decision for later. I think everyone should start bootstrapped. I think it creates the right discipline, creates the right focus in a way that being bloated with extra cash does not. I look back on the early days of Classy because remember, it was very difficult for us to raise anything. So we really didn't have a lot of money for many, many years. And that kept us laser focused. It forced us to make that decision. Like we were talking about with Jim Collins, Good to Great. Like if we had $5 million in the bank when we were making that decision, we might have decided to do both B2C and B2B and tried to be everything. And there were actually competitors that had raised big rounds from Silicon Valley. I don't know if the listeners would know these companies, but Rally and Fundly, who are no longer with us today, but they had the quote unquote mind share of the Valley because they had raised large rounds. So we always saw ourselves as a huge underdog because we were down in San Diego. We weren't in Silicon Valley. We didn't raise large rounds initially. But it ended up being our biggest strength. And guess who kept standing, through all of that? Like little old Classy, little old the little engine that could. And I think that story tends to play out more than people realize. It's the folks that are actually have either design constraints into the business or just have constraints that they're working with, because it forces creativity, it forces discipline, and forces focus. So my advice would be stay bootstrapped as long as you can. Once you are at product market fit and once you have shown that you have a repeatable sales model, that's when I think it's a really interesting question to pose. Would it make sense to raise money at that point to accelerate the growth or take some money off the table as a founder? Because that's something that we didn't do until more later rounds. And it was one of the smartest things we ever did. Just a small amount so that you're not just stressed through your, up to your eyeballs, and you can create a little bit of cushion for you and your family, but you're still super incentivized. You're still motivated. You still own the majority of the company. In no round we never gave away the majority. We always had balanced control. That's another thing that I would always make sure that is front and center. Don't chase valuation. Make sure that you're chasing good terms, and make sure that you retain what I would say control, but balanced control. But really, I don't think you need to raise money unless you really see an opportunity to accelerate. I think the longer you can stay bootstrapped, the better. But if you see a moment in time where it's like, you know exactly where you're going, you have clarity, and you have a repeatable sales model, it might make sense to do that. But I think you push that out as long as you can. Get the culture right, get the company and business model right, then do it. The folks that really struggle are the folks that raise a lot of money too early. They don't have the business model dialed in. They don't have the culture really they don't have the foundation of the culture set. And guess what happens? Like the thing breaks in half. And there is such a thing as breaking under your own weight, and if you have too much money and you're growing too fast and you haven't set those fundamentals correctly, like it's not a good place to be.
Yeah, it really is an accelerant. If you don't know the direction, it will only accelerate. You're almost going too fast to work through the state of ambiguity in the business. Like I love that you put it after, let's define the culture, let's define who we want to be, let's find product market fit, then we go raise. Talk to me about the evolution of Scott the founder through that phase. Like, dude, it's totally different to be, young, founder, running fundraising events in San Diego to now running a venture-backed software company, managing all the way up to, I think at its height, 300 employees. So talk to me about the evolution of what it took of your leadership to take the company through that process.
Yeah, I mean, in the earliest days, it was a passion project, and I think that's helpful because it helps connect your personal why to the mission more, which is good because that helps you get through the ups and downs. So I think that was fundamental. I'm glad we had those formative years prior to being a tech company where we were just getting super deep into like, why are we doing this in the first place? What's our motivation here? And I really do think that was extremely helpful. It was like the longest period ever of like customer development, you know what I mean? Because we were getting to know the space, getting into the nonprofits, understanding the fundraising market. Then we launched a product, so it was very organic. So I think that was a very helpful foundation. Once we got going as a tech company, I had never, I was technical, but I wasn't a software engineer. So we needed to round out the team. The co-founders were essential. One of them came from the prior events days, and then we added 2 additional, more technical co-founders to the team, which was huge. But we stayed about 20-ish or so people for quite a while through that whole bootstrapping and early fundraising piece. And I was the CEO from inception. I like to say accidentally because I was the one who went to the lawyer's office and got the corporate paperwork. So I became the CEO, but that's how these things happen. Luckily, my co-founders were very supportive of that decision. They saw something in me and they were always there to get my back, even through the worst times we had. And so I do think that the co-founder relationship is so vital. It's why Y Combinator screens for co-founder relationships. And it's not because the co-founder or the founder themselves are such a great CEO, such a great product lead, or such a great salesperson. It's because when you're about to quit, the leader or the co-founder, the other person helps them, walks them off the ledge, right? Like convinces them to keep going. And that alone is the difference between success and failure. A lot of times it's not even the functional expertise or any of that bullshit. So for me, the co-founders is like a support group. And yeah, you're going to get mad at each other. There's going to be bad days, but really making sure that relationship persists and you work on it is so fundamental to scaling and having the right support system around you. So for me, I literally just consumed everything I could from Yvonne's book, Let My People Go Surfing, all the way to other operational books like High Output Management is another one of my favorites. Of course, the Lean Startup at the time. I would consume SaaS blogs like David Scott's blog, like Lemkin, who was just getting started, like all of it. I mean, podcasts weren't as much of a thing, but I just consumed as much as I could. And I became a student of SaaS, really. Like I really wanted to become one of the best at understanding SaaS business models and how that applied to my industry. I would go way outside the nonprofit space. Frankly, I would look everywhere but the nonprofit space a lot of times just to learn as much as I could. And then I would always have this attitude like, I needed to earn my stripes as a CEO. There's a difference between the founder, being a founder, which is a permanent quote unquote position and actually not really a position. It's just a starting point, and the CEO role. So I never took the CEO role for granted. Just because I was the founder doesn't mean that I automatically deserve to be the CEO. And I always had that attitude because it forces you to have this always be learning mindset. When I say earn my stripes, it's like every phase of growth has a new criteria for excellence, not only the company, but you as the leader. And you have to be ahead of the company a lot of times in your personal development. So earn your stripes motto internally at Classy was no one is guaranteed a position. The position is going to change and you have to continue to earn and learn that position over time. Could you make it all the way to an IPO? Possibly. Not a lot of people do, but I'm rooting for you, including myself, right? Like that's the attitude. Nothing's guaranteed. We're all in this together. We're all learning. And if you might not even like the position you might end up in later. Like I could have opted out and been like, I'm more of a 50 person and under CEO, but now I don't, it's not for me. And that happens a lot. I kept going and I felt confident. I kept growing into my own shoes and confidence kind of. But there were other co-founders that ended up leading a decent sized team that was like, you know what? I actually just want to be an individual contributor. And we had the culture where that was okay. they were able to raise their hand and come to me and say, this, I know you said we got to earn our stripes. I've gotten this far. I don't want to leave the company though. Is there another position for me? And I would always do whatever I could to create another position or to put that person in another valuable role based on where we were headed, and then bring in a leader, either sometimes on top of them, or they would roll to me, or whatever the design was. But the fact that they had the courage to, and we had such the transparent relationship where they would raise their hand and say that, and it wasn't bottled up for years, which is totally common.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the proudest things about the whole journey, was just creating that type of culture with my co-founders, who started off as friends, to be honest. And they always say, don't do business with friends, right? So we broke all the rules, but it was because we had that trusting relationship and we were transparent with each other that I think we were able to get through it. But there were terrible times. There were times where we wanted to kill each other. I mean, for sure, those times happen. But we put the company first, and I think that's so critical. We because we had this like earn your stripes mentality, we were able to put our egos aside and then force ourselves to the table and get through those moments where some people just call it quits at that point. They're like, I'm just done with it. I cannot deal with this person. And these interpersonal dynamics tend to be the reasons why a lot of people quit. Not even the product, the market, the traction. It's literally they just can't handle the interpersonal dynamics with their co-founder or other executives, or they feel like they've been forced into a leadership position and they just aren't comfortable doing it. So to anyone listening, I just always, when you're starting out, when you're smaller, when these things aren't really a big deal, talk about them and just say, look, this is what other people that have gone through this have said. It's not going to be the same. Some of us might hit a ceiling at some point and then bust through that ceiling. Maybe they bust through in a different position. We just have to be flexible with each other to say, the exact scenario and where we're all in these seats now are not necessarily going to be the seats later. And that's okay. We just it's about the company, and we're going to do whatever we can to make the company successful.
Yeah. Scott, we talk about this a lot at a theoretical level. I'm curious to get your take on it tactically. If you say, let's just say that step one is, as a CEO, making that a known dynamic in the company. There are some of us that will make it through multiple phases of growth, and some of us will hit our ceilings. Whose responsibility is it to is that it for the CEO? You've said, hey, as long as I've named this as a dynamic, now it's on me to hold the bar, and it's on the individual contributors or the managers, just the team members, to recognize that and then drive their own growth? Or is there more responsibility, just in your opinion as a CEO, to support the growth from one phase to another? If so, like, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for us, it was so important that we put some of this into our actual core values. For example, adapt and overcome is the resilience piece. Always be learning, to try to drive a learning culture and what that means, right? Standing for something, which is the Patagonia side. So some of these themes that we've talked about, we actually made core values into the company. And that sort of like codifies it in a way on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, it has to sort of the whole idea is like, or the whole idea of earning your stripes, and the seat you're in now might not be the seat you're in the future. That just has to be led by the CEO and repeated. And then eventually your people team, your HR department, they have to be educated on that too. And you have to make sure that when someone shows up in one of those conversations, they have that same attitude. There needs to be consistency from what the CEO is saying into those performance management conversations, the career conversations. And you truly need to work with the person. You can't just be like, oh, cool. You don't feel like you're a leader, you're fired. You know what I mean? Like you have to actually practice what you preach. But it starts at the top too. I think it's a values-based thing. And those values trickle into performance management and how you actually design the people and the HR function of the company long term.
Yeah. I love it. So let's go back to the Classy story. Exiting a company can be a really scary time for a founder. For many, it's such a final decision, and a lot. You worked on this thing for 11 years. There's so much unknowns around what's it look like on the other side. How did that conversation get started?
Yeah, and it's funny. We quote unquote sold the company, and I'll explain why I put that in quotes in a sec, at the weirdest time, because we had just raised a Series D financing, 118 million. we raised a big portion of that was secondary, so we were returning some money to shareholders, which was awesome after so many years, and it relieved some pressure in terms of liquidity. So we were like set to go, and GoFundMe came knocking actually for the third time. And the fact that they actually approached us right in a position when we were in a position of strength was very interesting, because that typically is not what happens. And so it meant that they were really, really serious this time, and they had changed they had a new CEO. They had changed some of the executives, and we had some really great early conversations. But this is a story that started with the founding teams years before. That GoFundMe actually was founded in San Diego alongside Classy. We were totally two different businesses, but we used to actually help each other and collaborate on various things, from like what's the best payments software to use for our payments platform to use for the back end, or we pitched PayPal one time to build split and chain payments, which weren't a thing, and all these different things, these stories along the way. Brad and Andy and myself and Pat and Marshall, we became good friends. So we always joked, actually, wouldn't it be funny if the companies came together someday? Like, that would be kind of awesome. You'd have like the consumer side and the B2B side. Now that would be a force to be reckoned with. Like, ha ha ha, and we would go along our merry way. And then later down the road, like they approached us a couple of times inquiring, and it just didn't make sense for where we were at. We just had more things to prove, more things to figure out. And then this last time that they came, really it was about the potential of both companies. And this deal actually involved quite a bit of stock. So it wasn't just all cash. We're all gone, all the Classy people just, kind of go their merry way. This was actually a combo, and it is something where the story is continuing, but we're just as part of the GoFundMe team, which is different and unique. And I think that's important for why we made the decision. All of the shareholder base got to participate in the future story in one way or another. And that really was huge, because we had just done the Series D. We had relieved some cash pressure to the shareholders, and this unique opportunity comes along. And we basically said, we think we're better together. It was one of those. But this had been this story, this joke, had been going on for 9 years between the founders. And then the new CEO came in. Someone must have said something about their past interaction, and he got really into the idea, and they brought a business case forward that was compelling. And we brought it to the board, and we're like, you know what? This makes a lot of fucking sense. And really, just for the listeners, like, the rationale is you have 100 million plus people coming to GoFundMe from around the world. GoFundMe's in a lot of different countries that Classy's not. And they're all coming to look or donate to individual causes. And if someone comes to an individual cause, let's say, someone in an extended friend or family has cancer. So you go to that individual campaign, you donate. Well, wouldn't you, as a donor who just donated to the cause of cancer, maybe be interested in a couple nonprofit organizations that are working on the cure for cancer, or that specific type of cancer? And so Classy can come in and recommend those nonprofits to the donors. So really, it becomes a marketplace. And both Classy and GoFundMe together are now the biggest giving platform in the world. And we've raised over $30 billion for individual and nonprofit causes since we were founded. And we're picking up steam. Like, it's starting to, it's been about a year and a half, 2 years since the actual acquisition/merger. And we're just now starting to see the really cool synergies that everyone dreamt about. So it's incredibly exciting time for everyone at the company. And we're starting to really, I think, add unique synergetic value to the donors and the nonprofits in a way that no other platform in the world can do. And that was the idea. That was the appeal. And so we said, look, if we're talking about building a multi-decade long company that survives beyond any of us and adds value to the world, this is the way to do it. And that was really the rationale of the acquisition.
Man, so cool. So you guys had talked prior to GoFundMe coming and knocking. You said, hey, was the default plan, this is going to IPO one day after a Series D, or did you have a list of, hey, if there was someone that was an acquisition made sense, we had a short list of strategics that we would be like, yeah, that would be, this feels like it would be a 10 out of 10 outcome.
Yeah. Really the only two that I ever had in mind outside of our own independent path, which was the primary plan A, was GoFundMe and Salesforce. And Salesforce for a different reason. Salesforce took a little bit of their foot off the brake on the nonprofit higher ed vertical. And so GoFundMe came knocking at a unique time. I would say the upside for the company over almost a generation, multi-decades, is a larger opportunity with GoFundMe.
Yeah.
In terms of just like great outcome immediately for the team and everyone else, the Salesforce would have been different, would have been a different type of deal.
Mm-hmm.
But we felt like we always were building a 100-year long company. This was the way to do it. It was either basically go public or do this GoFundMe deal. And so we
Yeah.
chose to do the GoFundMe deal, and the future is bright with the company. There's no set plans to become a public company necessarily where everyone's taking their time, but it has the characteristics to be one someday.
Yeah.
Or it could stay private for a long time. I mean, we talked about Patagonia several times on
Yeah.
the pod so far. Like, that's actually a model company. They've been a private company for a long time. Not because they have anything to hide. Just look at anything he says, right? Like they just prefer it because they are able to block the company from activist investors, all sorts of different weird dynamics that play out as a public company, and they feel like they can fulfill their mission better.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily anti-IPO. It's more just let's just grow an awesome company and see what happens. So the deal and the merger was able to take some pressure off of that timeline, which is actually a great thing.
Yeah. I love it, man. You're a great illustration of it. We serve founders and help them find their perfect exit. And there's a few things that are prerequisites to that are all true in your story. The first one is we got to build a business that is a good one to sell, is a good one to run, right? So we got to have really strong economics. So that way, when the opportunity comes our way, we're operating from a position of strength. The second one is to have a list of dream buyers. You have a really good, your constraints breed creativity. They also just help, use a really powerful tool of what is no. So all those, like, I'm sure you're getting inquiry after inquiry, especially as Classy starts to build a momentum.
Totally.
A lot easier to raise investments, later down the road once it's been proven out. So you got to get a really good filter for what's an immediate yes and what's an immediate no. Man, you're just a great illustration of some of those, all of the foundational pieces put in place to be able to create an exit like you did at Classy. So I'm really, really curious. We'll use exit as, I know you're still continuing to be involved and there's a lot more work to be done. But I'm really curious. The money hits a bank account, the new chapter begins. Like, what do you think? What's the next thing you do?
Well, I had actually transitioned from CEO to chairman not that long before that. That was part of the Series D deal. So it was a little bit cleaner for me because I sort of had already, I've been doing it for 10 years. I already knew that the 10-year mark was kind of my time to move into like more of a chairman position. So for me, it wasn't as drastic. I had already had a succession plan. I already was like kind of phasing into that next phase, phasing into that next role, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So it was less drastic for me. I think, when you are acquired, even if you do own stock in the company that has acquired you, you lose a lot of control, and so you have to get used to that, right? Like you have to kind of trust the management team, the board of directors to have everyone's best interest in mind, and that has played out to be true. But I know there's a lot of scenarios where someone gets acquired by a company and that isn't the case, and they're not treated very well, or they're not integrated correctly, or what was promised on the front end doesn't actually end up materializing for their product. And that, I can see how that would be devastating, quite honestly, unless you just did an all cash deal and you just sailed away into wherever, right? But this was more of a partnership / merger. It was an acquisition formally, but it was really a partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And the integration part and realizing this vision is still crucial. But to GoFundMe's credit, they've done it in a really respectful and delicate way, not just to our team, but to our customers. And I think that we are just starting to see the fruits of all of that work and labor now. So I'm incredibly excited. But for me, I took a step back operationally. I was already part of that process was already happening. I play more of a strategic advisor role to the executive team, to the CEO, to my successor at Classy, who's now also the COO of GoFundMe. So I'm talking to them weekly, which is cool, but it's more on an ad hoc basis. I'm not like, I don't have to sit in on all the executive meetings and all that stuff. It really is a dream position right now. I don't know how long it'll last. They might kick me out or get sick of me, but it's awesome because they call me when they want to, and I can add real strategic advice about the market, about the product, about where we're headed. Sometimes I'll sit in on strategy, like offsites, things like that, but typically it's more ad hoc. And I purposely chose not to be on the board as part of the deal. I just wanted a clean break. But I still even advise some of the board members as well. So I'm pretty involved, but I'm able to start other projects, which is kind of the best of both worlds. And I'm now coaching founders as well through a program called Highland. That's been really rewarding. It's got me back in the trenches in a different way, which is kind of neat. And I'm able to share all the ups and downs and twists and turns and experience that I've gotten from the Classy journey. And I'm bringing in other guests, other successful entrepreneurs to contribute in that way too, similar to how you guys do it at SaaS Academy.
I love it. I think let's turn our focus there. So one of the promises of Highland is to help founders go from founders to CEOs. We talked a little bit about the difference there, but why don't you expand on that? What is the difference and what's the transformation you help founders create in their businesses?
Yeah, so being a founder or founding something is inherently a building role. You know, you're building a product and then you're trying to get it into the hands of customers. It's very scrappy. You're doing all roles. You know, you're basically you're critical to all decisions. You work pretty much around the clock. You're available to your team anytime, and all that's necessary. I mean, it's literally a life or death thing until you get to product market fit and really into like initial scale. Like you've got a repeatable thing. People want the product that you're selling. You've sort of dialed in price. There's so much calibration that needs to go into that first couple phases that you need to be hands-on. Like I call that build mode, and that's really inherent to a founder. And they a lot of times it's very natural. It just comes natural to them. Then you hit a point where the company needs you to work on the organization more than the product itself. And it needs to be scaled. You now have a product that someone wants, or a group of people want, that isn't like your mom and your uncle. It's like actual strangers that want this thing. So now you got to figure out how to scale it, how to build a repeatable sales and marketing process, how to grow and build the organization and the culture in the right way, and everything in between. There's a lot in there. I call that scale mode. And most founders have a real hard time transitioning from build mode to scale mode, or founder to CEO. And mainly because they're really good at build mode. They like it. It's fun. You know what I mean? Like it's something they're good at. They've never been trained how to be a proper CEO or scale themselves alongside scaling the business. And so what ends up happening is they become the bottleneck, and the business stagnates because of them and their leadership. And that's a super unfortunate thing. They might have the biggest market in the world and a great product, but because they can't get out of the way, they actually hold the company back. Oftentimes it isn't 100% self-identified, those cases. But they do come to me in Highland and say, hey, I know the potential's here. I see the signals, but I just don't know how to build the organization in the right way. And I don't know how to scale myself. So there's enough self-awareness where they're like coming in kind of knowing something needs to change. And I basically I show them the chart. I'm like, okay, here are all the things you're probably doing. Here are the things you need to be doing. Some people are stuck completely in build mode, but most commonly they have 1 foot in build mode, 1 foot in scale mode, and they're flip-flopping back and forth, and they're building some parts of the organization correctly, but not all the parts. And so they become, a weak point or a bottleneck. And so I help them figure that out. I help them see that. And we help them, we teach them how to build the right infrastructure, essentially, an operating system to go from roughly about $1 million in revenue, which is where most founders are at, some smaller, to tens of millions of dollars in revenue. Really, we help them lay down the framework and the foundation to get well past 100 million using the same principles.
Yeah, I love it. It's really interesting. We commonly refer to this as, I use 3 million as a proxy. Most businesses, when they get to 3 million in revenue, you're well into this dynamic. And that is that you're leading through leaders. So your value, the thing that makes you feel productive, has to change from the work product you produce, the decisions and outcomes you create, to the ones you create through your team, through other people.
Right.
And that is such a different, it's like almost like there's like so much discipline to go do that, especially if you've been the leader in every function. Like, oh my God, how hard is it to watch a sales leader take on a sales organization when you've been doing founder-led sales for years? If you have a down month, what's the founder want to do? throw
Jump
on the
back in.
sales hat,
Yep.
strap on the cape, and get into the trenches. How
Right.
have you? It sounds like you're focused exclusively on this challenge as well. What are some of the? Is it just like by pure pain you have to realize you just like made the business go sideways for long enough to then raise your hand and decide to move on? Like, how do you help a founder get to the point of realization that they really do need to show up differently in the business, and like what are you calling them towards tactically?
Yep.
I think one thing to understand it theoretically, they can probably point to the shrapnel they create in their business is based on having strapped on the cape and jump in the trenches. But what do you call them to?
Yeah, I mean they're basically breaking in half. You know what I mean? Like it's like you said, it could be that the business stagnates, that there's a lot of like pain, and they're going back into the weeds. But really, they're stressed beyond belief. Like they know in their heart that this is not sustainable. Like they're just in sprint mode and build mode, and they really need to figure out how to get themselves out of the weeds and build a real team. So first is the team, right? Like what team do you have around you? And what are the functions that you're way too deep in right now for your scale? How can we reorganize that particular team? How do you get a leader? How do you build a real leadership team? What is that? What do those people look like? What are the characteristics that you should hire for? And then it's working on the organization itself, partly to attract those leaders, but just partly to set up their success. And that starts with absolute clarity, vision. You revisit the mission, the vision, and the values and the goals of the organization. And oftentimes that gets worked on earlier and then set aside because you're just fighting fires for a while. But it's the perfect moment around this time, like post product market fit, initial scale, to revisit all of that stuff and make sure that you're providing absolute clarity, directional clarity to your entire team. In the 3 to 5 year window, down to the year, down to the quarter, down to the month. That's essential, and that's the CEO's job. Eventually, a COO or a chief of staff will assist with those things, but it's the CEO's job to lay the framework, lay the operating system where all this is very clear to everyone, and it really forces focus across the organization. That's truly critical. And if you can dial that in, then it's really attractive for people coming into the company. They're like, oh, wow, this is dialed in. This isn't a shit show. Like the CEO has laid the right foundation. Me as an experienced executive, maybe running sales, can now come in and go, oh, it's a real organization. Like this person is he or she, the CEO, knows what they're doing. I see where we're going. So it's just as much a recruiting tool as it is anything else, which is kind of awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's about like the other infrastructural components, the operational rhythm. How are you conducting the company on a annual, quarterly, and monthly basis? And that starts with everything from your annual kickoff all the way down to more granular and a one-on-one meeting with anyone that's on your team. And how do you do all of those meetings correctly, efficiently, and how do you place them and sequence them throughout the year so everyone has sort of a reliable rhythm that they know and can count on? But then how do you also not provide how do you make it not how do you not provide too much structure where it's too rigid and you sort of zap the creativity and the autonomy out of the organization? There is a fine line there. So that's a huge piece of it, right? So to kind of summarize, it's the personnel on the team, it's the clarity and the directional, like where are we all going together, and it's the operational system or rhythm that you need to lay. And those three things combined are really, in my opinion, the CEO's job to lead. And that gives them enough to do, right? Like if you say these are the things you need to focus on, when are they going to have time to jump into the weeds of product again? You know what I mean? Like they're like, holy crap, like that's what a CEO does, at this level. So there is a really eye-awakening thing. And then they start to roll it out and they see the tremendous benefit, and they start to see how these items are actually extremely high leverage. So if they get them right, then everyone starts adopting them. They don't need to be in the room all the time anymore.
Yeah.
It's all about building self-managing teams over time, teams that can operate and be successful without you there. And that's what this starts to do.
Identity is such a driver of how we show up in our businesses, how we see ourselves. And so it's one thing to understand tactically what to do. It's another thing to really evolve the identity into the identity of how we view ourselves in the business, how we, what our self-worth is based on. How often do you find that being the ceiling for someone creating this transformation versus you can learn the skill sets, but it's another thing to actually live it out. Have you found an effective tool for transitioning that identity to someone who shows up and is the visionary, attracts top talent, leads through other people?
So I think more founders have it in them than they realize. That's kind of my personal belief. They just haven't been taught what they're supposed to, how their role's supposed to evolve. So it's tough to go somewhere where you don't know where you're going or what it's supposed to look like, and what's ironic is, going back to like VCs and advisors and stuff like that, there's a lot of great operational support that VCs give their companies, from product to SaaS or to sales to marketing, but they don't actually have in-house executive training programs for the founder to transition to CEO, which is kind of nuts.
Yeah.
So they just like assume that the founder is going to figure that out, when that's probably the most critical point within the organization, and certainly can become the biggest bottleneck. But when I'm working with someone to go from build mode to scale mode, honestly, like when they see what's on the other side, when they see that role, they'll either opt in or opt out. Most opt in. But once they can see what that entails, some will say, I'm not sure I'm that person. I'm not sure I have the skills. My job is to show them and to encourage them to at least try, and not just self-select out before they know that they can actually develop into that. Because honestly, I'm a big believer in founder-led companies for as long as possible. But they need to be trained. They need to know what they're getting themselves into, and they need to earn their stripes. It's not just like, you don't just wear the role of CEO just because you put it on your business card. You have to develop into one. But in my opinion, the board of directors or the investors in the company need to support that CEO in that transition. And if you're completely bootstrapped and you don't have those things, then you need to seek them out. You need to be self-aware enough to know that founders doesn't equate to great CEO at scale. And you need to find advisors, find those resources, find things like SaaS Academy or Highland to help you in that development. But it is it's a really interesting inflection point for the company and the leader. Most often, the people that are in Highland will say, you know what, this makes sense and I can do that. And they'll get it. And there'll be like 10% that say, I'd rather just lead product, but I'm going to go find a CEO now. Or I think that's actually the role for my co-founder. It's a really interesting how they just immediately, they're like, oh, I get it now. This isn't so mysterious. I get what's needed from 1 million to 50 million or 100 million. And then they can be in control of that decision. It's not something that's imposed upon them mysteriously. Like, you're doing such a bad job, Mr. Founder CEO. And you're like, I thought I was doing the right things, but no one ever taught me what those were. Right. So I think it's a really I think it's a moment where the weight is lifted off their shoulder. They see what they need to go do, and they can be in control of that decision to say, hey, I got that in me. I think that's me, or not. And that's fine, because it's about the company.
Man, Scott, I think that what you're doing at Highland is such a valuable, just a gift back. I mean, you could do all kinds of things with your time. It's one thing to learn these things conceptually. It's another thing to be speaking to someone who's been there and done that. You speak with some lived experience. I'm guessing some of these lessons were learned the hard way. Was there a hard-earned lesson in this transition for you at Classy that it allows you to speak from that level of experience?
Yeah, I mean, there's one on the team building side, and then there's one on the fundraising side. That's a cautionary tale that I'll let you in on. The first one on the team side, I mean, I think that the thing that I struggled the most with as a founder was getting the leadership team correct, and later, I think building a proper executive team, which is a little different than a leadership team. In the beginning, your leadership team 1.0 is the founding team. Then eventually you have to start to say, okay, well, we need functional experts across marketing, sales, all these different functions. So sometimes that can be the co-founders, but likely it's other people too. The co-founders just don't run everything forever. That doesn't make sense. And then there's a period where you have to really assess, are these sort of homegrown people, which tends to be the case, which is awesome, by the way. I love starting in-house first versus just hiring gray-haired like corporate executives that can blow back in your face. But there's a moment in time where you have to really look around the table and say, are these the right people running these functions? Like I'll just make up names. Mike's running marketing. Mike came with us, he's been with us for 5-6 years. He had no marketing experience. That's probably not an issue, but you need to have an honest conversation. Is this the person to take us to the next level? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Same with the co-founders. And this is very difficult. And this is where I didn't always get this right. A co-founder can be running a function for maybe too long because they have the founder title, just like you might be the CEO for too long because you have the founder title. So it applies to co-founders too. And that's where you really have to have those open and honest conversations between each other to say, A, do you want this role? And B, do you honestly feel like you're the best person for this next journey? And let's be really clear about what that entails. So we're starting this. Highland helps CEOs see what it entails to go from founder to CEO. But just like that, your executives around the table, your leaders, if it's a co-founder, they need to know what marketing, the marketing 1.0 leader, they need to understand the transition from marketing 1.0 to marketing 2.0 to 3.0 so they can say, am I that person, right? It's the same thing that you're doing with the CEO, but you got to do it across the table. So I delayed those tough conversations too long. I eventually had them and they were great. Well, they weren't great at first, but it ended up being the right moves. Right. But always have the hard conversation as quick as you can, be self-aware, be open and honest about those roles. And then when we were hiring like more external big executives, I made a lot of mistakes there too. Partly on the hiring front, the type of person. I assumed that like A+ talent somewhere else meant A+ talent at Classy. That wasn't always the case. There's a lot of values-based stuff that we should have been doing in the hiring process to really understand what type of person this is, to make sure they mesh with the culture. I had a great advisor who later became a board director and later became my successor, who used to call this organ rejection. So when someone came into the company and they might be awesome somewhere else, like, another big SaaS company that everyone would know, they're excited, but then for some reason the culture just rejects them. They have organ rejection because the values aren't the same. It's just not, they're not taking the company in the right direction, because every new executive is going to help the company evolve, but it has to help it evolve in the right way. It's going to naturally, executives have big personalities, all these things. You want them pushing the company forward in the right direction. Sometimes they'll go sideways though. And it's not even necessarily because they're doing anything wrong per se. It's that they are trying to copy a formula that they've seen somewhere else, apply it to the company they just joined, and then shit kind of goes haywire and the company's like, no, this isn't the way we operate here. And that's what great cultures do. They assess what's going on. They'll take the good for the good, but if there's some bad there, they'll really look at that critically. And then in the worst cases, they'll almost fire the person for you because it's been rejected by the culture. And so that happens sometimes. It's painful. It's painful to hire, spend all the money, bring in a new executive, and then fire them 6 months to a year later. That no one wants to do that. So for me, spending more time researching, interviewing, getting that front end right, really thinking through who are going to be the best people for these roles that can last at least 3 years. And 3 years is a good amount of time when you're at scale. Like, I think you can really look in probably 2 to 3 year windows. And if they make it further than that, fantastic. But you're really looking for like the best person in the world for that 3 year stretch.
Yeah.
And I just made too many mistakes, or I had to learn through a lot of painful lessons on the executive team.
Man, it's I can feel the pain. I've lived it a few times myself of realizing you made the wrong hire. And I think that the longer I operate, the longer it takes me to hire. It just keeps getting longer, just because of how many, we add an extra step to the interview process. We make sure they meet with the team. Like, you really, you recognize how impactful it is to put the right person in the right role, especially that has that lived experience for where we're trying to go. Like, it is such a gift to make the hire for, like you said, the bad side is they come in, they try to run a playbook that they've ran somewhere else and it's not the right play. It's incredible when they can come in and run a playbook they've done somewhere else when it is the right play, because there's so much less, so much less guessing involved. They speak with a level of conviction, and they've seen, I say all the time, like, I want someone who's been to the promised land and is coming back and telling us what it looks like. So I've just continued to add more steps to the hiring process. Last point.
I think you're dead. Oh, I think you're dead on. You want me to tell you the fundraising story real quick?
Yeah, that's what I was about to get to.
Okay, cool. Like, for folks that are thinking about raising money or have raised money, and this ties into the hiring of the executive team, actually, when you raise money, especially when you raise a large venture round, you are, even if the board is balanced and no one has quote unquote control, those investors will have a lot of influence over the decisions that you make, the decisions the board, suggests you make, and all of the things in between. That's natural. And that's, in a way, can be a good thing, because there should be a trusted advisor. But what I saw and experienced a lot was, we would raise money. People would come in with their hard thoughts. They'd come in objectively, right? Like, and be like, "Oh, you need this, or you need that," right? And typically this would be like, "You need a CFO, or you need a new this, or you need that," and that would like almost just push us unnaturally to go higher at an accelerated rate. And it felt like, oh my God, this person's everything. And like, there's never a case where one person is everything, but the investors will put a lot of pressure on you to hire that person, because they see a gap, and it's assumed that the person's going to fill that gap and take you to the promised land. And that's going to be the silver bullet that, fixes all the company's problems. And it's not to say that like key hires, leadership hires aren't massive leverage, because they actually are. But again, you don't want to rush that decision. And the worst fundraising mistake I ever made was letting in our Series C investor, who was a private equity investor, not a venture investor. And it was just a total mismatch of values and a lot of things. And we went through this where he would say, "You need this, you need that, you need that." And a couple of them didn't work out, but then he would point the finger and blame the company and the founder for making those wrong choices. And that's a cycle you don't want to be in, where it turns into a blame game. And for us, that actually went much further, where that person turned unbelievably sour and actually tried to kick me out and the whole management team out of the company. And we were sizable. We were tens of millions of dollars in revenue at this point. And it was essentially an existential threat. We had an activist investor, and we had to rally the internal shareholder base to buy this person out, or we were done. We were basically going to run out of cash, and we were going to have to hand the keys to the castle to this investor who was bleeding us dry and wouldn't let equity, or wouldn't let any cash or new money come into the company, wouldn't allow us to give employees stock options, and many, many other really, really nefarious things. And so I've lived that, and we ended up successfully raising the capital to buy this company out and kick this person off the board. And not surprisingly, the company took off right after that.
Wow.
I mean, we literally went through it's like we had a sickness just because of the person that we accepted the money from at the time. And I chased valuation. Wow. I did all the wrong things. Luckily, the terms of the deal were pretty clean, because that's how we were able to actually defend ourselves. Because if we had let junk terms in with a high valuation, we would have been fucked. And so really, it was like it's a cautionary story, because every other investor I let in were actually quite awesome, and were supportive. And I got really lucky. And I made one bad choice, and it was 3 years of absolute hell. Worst 3 years of my life. We thought the company was going to go under, and it was actually a big company. We would have let so many shareholders, teammates, customers down from what was essentially a power move. It was a greedy, profiteering move. And for me, from that point forward, I look at anyone I'm going to go into business with, but certainly take money from, as one of the most important decisions that you'll ever make. And that played out at Classy. And we're lucky to tell the tale and have this awesome story that we started with. But it was through stories like that. That was probably our worst one. We didn't think we were going to get through that. But it's gnarly. And you live, you try to live to fight another day, even when you're tens of millions of dollars in revenue and you think you got it, right?
Yeah.
You don't always got it. You got to still think through these decisions.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate you sharing that story. And I think it's a great illustration of just a lot of what I enjoy following along, the content that you share. And I'm looking forward to your next chapter as you go into teaching and sharing more, is that you're a super purpose-driven person. And I think that it is core to your philosophy and company building. Get aligned with like the values that's going to inform the vision of the company. What do we want to be when we grow up? Who do we let in? Who do we take money from? It sounds like most of your best decisions came from from that clarity, and the ones that were, the lessons you survived were the ones that illustrated how important that is. So Scott, man, really appreciate you coming on and sharing. Congrats on, the closing of one chapter. Super excited to see what's coming up next. We'll drop in the show notes if you want us to follow along. Scott's got some really awesome content on his personal website. We'll drop all the links to follow, but really appreciate you coming in and jamming with me today.
Oh, super fun. Thanks for having me.